Welcome back to my channel, everyone. So in this video, we're going to look at this fact sheet that addresses internationally qualified registered nurses with a sole qualification in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing. The Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia undertakes functions as set by the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law as in force in each state and territory. The NMBA regulates the practice of nursing and midwifery in Australia, and one of its key roles is to protect the public. They do this by developing registration standards, professional codes, guidelines, and standards for practice which work together to establish the requirements for the professional and safe practice of nurses and midwives in Australia. The following information is applicable for internationally qualified registered nurses with qualifications solely in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing. Notations for nurses with sole qualifications. How are registered nurses with qualifications solely in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing registered in Australia? Registered nurses who have a sole qualification in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing do not have a qualification that is not sustainably equivalent to a Nursing and Midwifery Board agency approved qualification leading to registration as a registered nurse. Depending on your area of practice, RNs with one of these qualifications are registered with a notation stating that they are solely qualified in the area of mental health nursing or pediatric nursing or disability nursing. What does the notation mean? The notation is used by national boards to describe and explain the scope of a practitioner's practice by noting the limitations on that practice. The board expects that nurses and midwives recognize and work within their scope of practice, which is determined by their education, training, authorization, competence, qualifications, and experience in accordance with local practice. Are there any other specific areas of nursing that receive a notation in Australia? No. These are the only areas of nursing that a notation applies. Will a notation reflect badly on my professional status? No. A notation is not an indication of any concern about your performance or ability as an RN. Notations are used to provide relevant information to employers and the public on an individual registration status in these circumstances, the area in which they are qualified. How do I qualify for registration as a registered nurse with a qualification solely in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing? The board assesses all internationally qualified nurses against 3 qualifying criteria for registered nurses. In order to be eligible for registration, applicants must meet all 3 criteria as well as all registration standards listed on the application form, such as recency of practice, English language skills, etc. Criterion 3 requires that your qualification must be assessed as being equivalent to an Australian bachelor degree. What happens if my qualification is assessed at QAF Level 6? Nurses with qualifications solely in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing at QAF Level 6 will be registered with condition for 12 months full-time equivalent supervised practice. The board has decided that this is an appropriate pathway to assess the applicant's eligibility for registration. On successful completion of the supervised practice, the condition will be removed. So what they're simply saying is you have not fully met the qualification standard, and therefore you have to be supervised for 12 months. After 12 months, the condition of supervision will be removed. Supervised practice. What does supervised practice mean? When the board imposes conditions requiring supervised practice on your registration, it means that you must work under supervision as agreed with the board. The requirements are tailored to the purpose of supervision. Why are supervised practice conditions necessary for my registrations? Where you do not meet all requirements for registration, supervised practice is to help assure the board of your competence. Patients have a right to expect safe, competent, and contemporary nursing care at all times. This includes when care is given under supervisory arrangements. Correct supervision reassures the board and the community that a nurse's practice is safe and does not place the public at risk. Do I need to arrange my own supervised practice? Yes, you're responsible for making sure that your employer meets the board's requirement for supervised practice. What specific conditions for supervised practice can I expect on my registration? The board can decide to impose whatever conditions it considers necessary or desirable for your particular circumstances, and it is likely that your registration will be subject to conditions that will require you to demonstrate competence to practice as a registered nurse. These are the standards that provide the minimum expectation of practice for a registered nurse, and they inform the education standards for registered nurses in Australia. Other requirements that may be included in your conditions include to undertake supervised practice for a period of 12 months full-time equivalent, and to provide the board with a supervised practice plan and supervision agreement that you have agreed and completed your supervision, that you have agreed and completed with your supervisor. Please note that these conditions are general and your specific conditions may differ at the board's discretion. If supervised practice conditions are imposed on your registration, your supervisor will be required to submit a report at the end of the supervision period assessing your performance against the board's registered nurse standards practice. What will the conditions on my registration state? Your registration will include the schedule of supervised practice conditions for registered nurses with qualifications solely in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing. Do I need to start my supervised practice immediately after being registered? No, there is no required start date for employment with supervised practice. However, you will need to make sure you can meet the recency of practice and continuing professional development registration standards when you renew your registration. Registration expires on 31st of May every year. How long must I work under supervision? Internationally qualified nurses with qualification level 6 in mental health, disability, or pediatric nursing are generally registered with conditions for 12 months full-time equivalent supervised practice. This represents average hours over a specified period which is equal to that of a full-time employee or student. The full-time equivalent hours per week are defined as 37.5 hours or 150 hours per month. So generally, they're just saying that at least you need to work 8 hours per day to meet the 150 hours per month. Over a 12-month period, this means you will need to work 1,800 hours of supervised practice. If you're working full-time, you must undertake supervised practice of 12 months with a minimum of 150 hours worked per month. If you're working part-time, you must undertake supervised practice for as long as it takes you to complete the required 1,800 hours. So that last part means there is no limit of how long it can take you to finish your supervised practice when you're working part-time. Who is going to pay if there are costs involved in fulfilling conditions on my registration? You are responsible for paying any costs associated with any board-approved conditions on your registration. Can I do supervised practice in a private hospital or with a private agency? You can only do supervised practice in a private hospital, but not a private agency. Can any health professional supervise my practice? Your supervisor must be a registered nurse who has a minimum of 24 months full-time equivalent experience and no conditions on their registration as a registered nurse. You can have more than one supervisor, but they must all meet these requirements. Does supervised practice mean I have to be directly supervised at all times? Supervision can be direct or indirect. The level of supervision required will be determined initially by the board and by your supervisor during your supervised practice. Your level of supervision will depend on your past experience and your performance in the workplace. What happens with the condition on my registration when I renew registration? If annual renewal of your registration arises before you have completed your supervised practice, we will renew your registration with the same conditions. Must I tell my employer of the conditions on my registration? Yes, you need to inform your employer of your conditions and provide a copy of the conditions with your employer's signature to the board within the term specified on the conditions. What happens if I change employment during my period of supervised practice? You will need to inform your new employer of conditions and provide a copy of the conditions with your new employer's signature to the board within the term specified on the conditions. You will also need a new supervisor who works for your new employer. How will you know that I have met the conditions on my registration? The board will determine its assessment based on your supervisor's assessment report when you complete the period of supervised practice. Is there a way to avoid supervised practice? If you do not wish to be supervised, you will need to apply or to upgrade your qualification to a bachelor degree nursing qualification in your country of origin or in Australia. In Australia, you do this by enrolling in a Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia approved pre-registration program leading to registration as a registered nurse, such as Bachelor of Nursing. You may seek advanced standing for previous study, recognition of prior learning. This means that you can seek exemption to cover what you have already qualified or studied overseas. And the decision to recognize prior learning is made by the education provider, and the board does not influence this decision. So for you to be recognized that you have studied overseas and you want an exemption for that study, that is a discussion between you and the education provider. Will my employer incur any costs as a result of my supervised practice? There will be a resource committee required by your employer to provide your supervision. You need to negotiate with your employer, as this does not have anything to do with the board. Is there a toolkit to help me complete necessary documentation for my supervised practice? Yes. The board has published templates and guidelines which can be found under the Supervised Practice section on the board's website. I believe we have covered some interesting questions, and I will end this video here and come back with another one detailing more information about the National Council licensure exam for registered nurses. Thank you for your time. I'll catch you in the next one.